Hey everyone, welcome back to Tech Talk. I'm Julia Beauchamp and I am here with security reporter J.M. Porup from CSO, and today we're talking all things 2019 security predictions, so stay tuned. So J.M., thank you so much for being here with us today. Always a pleasure. Always great when you can Skype in. So security is pretty much always on people's minds, whether they're consumers or people in, businesses. Something that is huge that just happened, right here in January it's going on right now, is the issue with Apple, the FaceTime glitch, where you can FaceTime someone and even if they don't answer, you can listen in and sometimes even see their video feed, which is a little creepy. So security always on people's minds. But today we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be focusing a little more on the enterprise side of things. So can you tell me a bit about what security was like in 2018, some of the big trends that you saw with enterprise?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Apple FaceTime bug is an interesting one and thought-provoking, because how is it that Apple has cash reserves of how many hundreds of millions of dollars, and this is a relatively trivial bug. Mm-hmm. How is it that they are not spending that cash reserve to actually secure their operating system? And for companies, how many companies have the cash reserves of an Apple? They also have to be asking, if Apple can't adequately protect itself, then how can anyone else possibly do so? So there's almost existential questions on the line here. And that really brings us to the first topic that we want to discuss, of course, is the Yahoo lawsuit that got settled just last week.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a bit of background, Yahoo execs were basically held accountable for the gross negligence of of Yahoo's security breach, when was that?
Oh, this is going back. I would need to check the date, but this is 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah, years.
There were several, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a slap on the wrist, but it was nevertheless a judicial recognition for the first time that the idea that gross negligence in information security exists as a legal concept in civil litigation, and that directors who can normally be held liable for gross negligence in other areas of corporate administration can now be, in theory, held personally accountable for committing gross negligence in the information security world as well. And that's really sort of a positive step forward, I think, for society and corporate governance. But it's going to be on a lot of executives' minds going forward that they can't just shoot from the hip or cover up breaches or try and ignore these issues. Information security issues are not going away. They're going to get worse. And executives have to do their due diligence.
Absolutely. So this lawsuit was sort of finalized pretty recently, yeah?
Yeah, that's correct.
So, that was then, a few weeks ago. This is now. What do you see going forward? Do you think that execs of big companies, tech or not tech, are going to be, do you foresee them either being held more accountable for their business's security or lack thereof of good security, or do you maybe at least see them really making sure that their business is engaging in the best security practices? Do you see them taking initiative?
Well, I think there's kind of from a very high level, two broad groups of companies here. There's the Silicon Valley move fast and break things model. And I think we're beginning to see the end of that era, because too many things are broken now, and we've incurred too much technical debt. And I think Yahoo's breach was very much, at the zenith of that sort of movement, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I think tech companies who are stewards of vast amounts of consumer and citizen data, I think they've already woken up to the fact that they have to do a better job of securing that data. But their business is data. Like if you're a Yahoo, that's what you do. You don't make refrigerators. You don't sell cars. Your business is data. But then you have the legacy businesses. You have finance, you have manufacturers. If I'm a refrigerator maker and I'm doing internet-connected refrigerators, my core competency is the manufacturer of refrigeration machines. It is not computer security or software engineering or hardware manufacturing. This is all being outsourced, often by people who don't have deep technical knowledge of these issues. So we're going to find out. I mean, I think this brings us to the IoT issue. You know, we have Internet of Things devices widely being deployed, being rushed to market in the search for increased quarterly revenue with little thought of the long-term consequences, and that's not going to end well, I don't think.
Yeah, so let's talk about IoT security. It's a hot topic, and quite frankly, as IoT devices and IoT technology advances, the security isn't really advancing alongside it. And that's obviously going to be an issue for consumers who are, buying IoT doorbells and IoT refrigerators, but it's also going to be an issue for enterprises that are relying on IoT devices to either secure their businesses and just to help with lots of factors in their enterprise. So how do you see IoT security going forward in this year, over the next year or two?
Right. Well, it's not just, it is a question of how it impacts the consumer and the enterprise. But if we look at something like the Mirai botnet, where, millions of vulnerable IoT devices are enslaved by a botnet and then used to DDoS the website or enterprise of your choice, this then becomes a threat to the safety and integrity of the internet as a whole. So it becomes, people like to make comparisons to public health. If there is an infectious disease outbreak, then that becomes a collective security concern and not an individual security concern. So the idea that an individual non-technical consumer is responsible for securing their IoT device is clearly unreasonable. Nobody could reasonably say that.
Yeah.
But the problem is that if I'm selling fridges, the last thing I want to do is be maintaining the security of the fridge for the next 30 years. I want to take my profit and go away. And we see all sorts of alarmist responses to this, widespread issue. We have the alarming news from Japan just a couple days ago that the Japanese government plans to automatically hack into every IoT device in Japan to test them for bad default passwords, and then notify the owner to fix the password. I mean, this is the digital equivalent of the police going door to door, picking locks and trying to kick down doors, and then leaving a note saying, your lock was pickable, your door hinges were weak. Sorry, we kicked your door down. Please put a better one in. This is, really not a great idea, but the problem is getting so bad. I predict we're going to see more and more of these sort of alarmist, almost authoritarian responses to the issue, which should concern everyone, I think.
Absolutely, because it's walking the line of infringing on citizens' privacy, but then, governments, the Japanese government is saying, well, we want to make sure that our citizens are protected when in 2020 that the Olympics will be in Japan, and they want to make sure that citizens and the Olympic event itself that IT infrastructure is protected. So it's a tough argument for any government to make that this is really doing good. And as I don't blame Japanese citizens for feeling like their privacy is being infringed upon.
First of all, Japan has a bona fide interest in securing the Olympic Games. Like, nobody is going to criticize that. There were issues the last time around. Like, Japan has a bona fide threat to deal with. So there's that. But okay, let's say you secure all the IoT devices in Japan. Well, Japan may be a physical series of islands, but on the internet, everything is connected to everything else. Mm-hmm. So okay, you've secured your devices, but that doesn't mean IoT devices in, China can't attack you, or IoT devices in Canada or Brazil. I mean, are you going to like attack, IoT cameras in South America to secure them for the Olympics in Japan? Like, is that really, I feel like this is a solution that was not very well thought out.
Interesting, or at least not explained very well.
Defended.
Right? So that's what Japan is doing with its IoT devices. But here in the U.S., there's similarly, our IoT devices aren't any more or less secure than Japan's, I would assume.
Yeah, I would say, par for the course.
So how about here in the U.S.? How is the government taking steps to make sure that IoT devices are secure? Or are there even any government-sanctioned IoT best practices guidelines out there?
Sure. Well, it's a very much ad hoc on a sector-by-sector basis, mostly by regulators who are stretching the limits of their regulatory authority to try to do the right thing. For instance, in the consumer space, you see the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, doing very noble work in terms of using their limited powers to enforce fair trade practices and to enforce best security practices. I think most companies are on notice and know they are on notice that if they engage in gross negligence, the FTC may well come after them. But the FTC has limited authority in a very limited arena. For instance, if we're talking about connected medical devices in a hospital, that's not the FTC's territory. That's the FDA. And the FDA also has some very clueful people who care very much about the security of IoT devices in hospitals, but they too have limited regulatory enforcement power and are doing the best to beat drum their bully pulpit to sort of improve that situation. And on, Department of Energy for infrastructure and so forth and so on. So we see a very piecemeal, ad hoc approach by regulators stretching the limit of their legacy powers, while the government itself has taken a, unfortunately, hands-off approach when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, I want to know what you think. Do you think having some sort of guidelines recommended by the government, do you think that would be helpful in the U.S.? Or at least force manufacturers to follow something?
Well, see, being specific in regulations is a genuine issue. And we see this with the GDPR, for instance. The GDPR requires minimum security best practices to protect citizen data, but doesn't specify brand of firewall or operating system version, because that would be obsolete by the time the law became law. So this is a genuine issue. Like, how do we regulate minimum security controls at a time of constant change? So the best approach appears to be some sort of high-level principle, like here are the general principles that you have to do, and then that law points to sort of normative cultural best practices in the security community as you have to be in line with the best practices, which is not a perfect approach, but seems to be the least bad alternative available to us.
Sure. Do you see something like that happening in the next year or two?
Well, I don't think it's going to come out of Washington in the next year or two, but we do see that coming out of California. I mean, for instance, we see New York State passing laws recently for financial cybersecurity. California recently passed a law for consumer cybersecurity. And I would expect to see California is probably going to be leading the way on this issue.
Interesting. So, also, on the topic of cybersecurity, there's been a trend over the past year or so, maybe longer, you can correct me, but of businesses having a really tough time hiring cybersecurity experts. And there's a multitude of reasons for it. Hopefully you can touch on a few, but do you think that this industry is going to continue to have tons of employment opportunities, but not a lot of candidates? Or do you think that maybe more people will go towards cybersecurity jobs?
Well, there's a host of issues there. The first and foremost is that there is a genuine demand for more qualified cybersecurity professionals in enterprise and in government. Um, the biggest problem is that enterprises don't want they want to hire an experienced senior expert, and there are only so many people with 5 to 10 years of cybersecurity experience. They don't want to hire juniors and train them. But the problem is that results in inflated salaries and bidding wars, and you're not growing the pool of potential employees, and an unwillingness to invest in junior and mid-level security people is a real problem, and really the only solution that I see. And also an unwillingness to look at remote workers, because in many cases, work can be performed remotely. Not always, but there are many cases where remote is a viable option for security professionals. And given a very small supply for a very large demand, it seems like both training and apprenticeships for employees as well as remote are things that enterprises should be looking at, because the demand is just going to continue to grow. And if enterprises insist on focusing on short-term quarterly results and keeping employee expenditure low, then that's going to have long-term negative consequences by not investing in your own workforce and training them to be the security professionals that you need.
Absolutely, and I would assume that if you're not looking at if you're not looking at the long term, your security practices are going to suffer.
Indeed.
So,
I think this is partly an indictment of short-term thinking in terms of profit-making enterprises who executives are judged on yearly and quarterly financial returns. They are not judged on the 10 to 20-year health of the enterprise. And that creates misplaced incentives for those executives and for the enterprise as a whole. And absent some sort of regulation or sea change in the industry, I don't see how to solve that problem.
yeah, and this is a real issue of just not having actual people doing the work, because AI and computers can only do so much to protect an enterprise. It requires a lot of just good old-fashioned man or woman power.
Yeah, and enterprises are trying to solve this problem with machine learning, artificial intelligence, and there are orchestration and automation tools that can greatly increase the efficiency of any individual security professional in their job. But there are limits. There are limits to exactly how much you can extract from that sort of almost cyborg employee, a human employee whose work is augmented by a machine learning algorithm. You still need more humans dealing with human adversaries, because an intelligent human adversary is going to be able to game a machine learning algorithm.
Yeah, so without sort of an attitude change, you don't really foresee this problem of finding talented cybersecurity professionals going away.
Well, how long does it take to train somebody to be an experienced and effective cybersecurity professional? Well, I mean, security today is a very broad field. I mean, there is a wide gamut of roles required to be filled. But as with any profession, you don't get from zero to expert in 12 months. It takes 3 to 5 years just to be good at your job and 10 to be a master of your job. And if you don't start investing in those people now, you're not going to have the pipeline of people you need 5 years from now.
Absolutely. And you're not going to have these talented professionals that can help protect your business from other adversaries. So there's multiple ways that a business can be attacked. And, we've discussed some, but one of them can be ransomware.
Sure. I mean, yeah, please.
I'm not saying, if you're not hiring great cybersecurity professionals, your business is going to be attacked by ransomware. That's not what we're saying, but that's one of the outcomes.
Well, I mean, ransomware has been a growing threat to the enterprise for the last several years, and I think one may fairly predict that ransomware will continue to be a plague in 2019 and beyond. But by and large, ransomware is affecting unpatched systems. Ransomware is using old days, not 0 days. So if you patch your stuff, then you are essentially not vulnerable to ransomware. But yet ransomware continues to flourish, both because of one, a poor patching practices, and two, systems that are unable to be patched. There are systems in critical infrastructure running Windows XP, and they will continue to run XP because that is how they're built, and they cannot be upgraded. So dealing, the first problem is solvable by having more security people, testing patches and deploying patches in as timely a manner as is feasible given a particular circumstance. And we're not seeing that happen. And this is, prevention. What's the saying? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Invest in your people. Test those patches, deploy those patches, have, a process in place to do that. And that is a difficult but solvable problem. Dealing with infrastructure running legacy unsupported versions of Windows or Linux is a much more difficult problem to solve, and one without a glib answer in the short time we have available today.
Yeah, absolutely. So could you just recap a few of the big ransomware attacks, maybe of just the past year or so, any big ones that stand out to you is that as especially important, and also something that can be learned in, and perhaps businesses, but also just nations can adapt in the next few years?
Well, certainly the WannaCry and Petya ransomware attacks were very unpleasant worms that spread across the internet over the last 2 years. But then we also saw the NotPetya wiperware attack, which pretended to be ransomware, but just destroyed your data, and you could not even pay a ransom to get it back. And a key point in terms of public policy is that these worms utilized a vulnerability in Windows SMB called by the NSA called Eternal Blue, which the NSA chose not to disclose to Microsoft for patching, but instead chose to weaponize. And that exploit was stolen by the shadow brokers, who most believe to be cutouts for Russian intelligence, and those people dumped those exploits on the internet for anyone to use. And so one key point to ask, if you're the enterprise and you are affected by ransomware or wiperware like WannaCry or Petya or NotPetya, our own government here in the United States is at least partly responsible for the economic damage caused by those ransomware attacks. Maersk, the giant global shipping company in Denmark, that I think they carry something like 35% of the world's cargo containers, massive infrastructure. They were hit hard by NotPetya and suffered more than $300 million in economic loss. And if NSA had disclosed Eternal Blue to Microsoft for patching and chose not to weaponize it, Maersk would not have suffered that economic loss. The search for perfect security, as we've seen in many contexts over the last 2 decades, is a futile and counterproductive goal. But we do mitigate risk. We minimize risk. We take reasonable precautions. We do our due diligence. And I think, we aren't, as a society, we aren't even doing that. And I think we need to get to the point where we are performing our due diligence and then revisit the topic.
Absolutely. So hopefully over the course of, the next few years, we can get used to, as individuals, as a society, and businesses can get used to the idea of really making sure that they're using the current best security practices and adapting as they see fit.
One can only hope.
We can dream. Thank you so much, JM.
My pleasure. Thank you, Juliet.
And thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Tech Talk. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We'll see you next time.